There we go. And we are now recording, as far as I can tell. I will get the disclaimer out of the way now that any opinions expressed by the speakers are their own and do not represent official positions of their employers. And please let me introduce our speakers in case you don't know who we are and you're joining us new to MOLA.
Paco.
Ooh, could you mute yourself? That wasn't Oliver. Thank you. Let me introduce Russ Girsberger, please. He holds degrees in music education, music history, and library and information science. He served as assistant chief librarian with the United States Marine Band in Washington, D.C., and has worked with the Boston Symphony, Boston Pops, and the New York Philharmonic. He has led the performance libraries at both New England Conservatory and the Juilliard School. He is currently the librarian for the Navy School of Music in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and provides classroom instruction. He is an honorary member of MOLA, an association of music performance libraries. Russ is a published author several times over, with books including Insights and Essays on the Performance Library with co-author Lori Lake, as well as a manual for the Performance Library. Thank you so much for being with us today, Russ, and we are lucky to have you.
Thank you.
I'm Jane Cross, and I'm currently music archivist at the Library of Congress. I formerly served as the chief librarian at the U.S. Marine Band, and my degrees are in music, English, and library science. I'm also an honorary member of MOLA, and I'm currently serving on the board of directors. If you'd like more information about MOLA, please visit the website, and you can also find us on Facebook. And just as a side note, even though Russ and I both served in the U.S. Marine Band, we were not there at the same time. We were mutually exclusive.
Tag team.
What was that, Russ?
It was a tag team match.
Yeah, right. We were tag teaming. So the format for today, like I said, is a bit ad hoc. We'll talk for a while and introduce some basic concepts, but primarily we'd like there to be time for questions and discussion. Feel free to jump in at any time. And you're welcome to interrupt us politely as we go, so you can get clarification or share with others what has and maybe what has not worked for you when you've been cataloging music. Many of you may have even more relevant experience than we do, and what you share can certainly help others. We're going to briefly cover why even bother cataloging. You may have shelf arrangement that works just fine for you, but you may be considering cataloging. So we'll help push you over the edge and get you entering data. What technologies or formats are available for you to capture that data? When you're cataloging, what is the basic information you should capture? And maybe what are some expanded fields you might want to get into? We're also going to discuss authority control, which will benefit and aid sorting and searching, among other things. And hopefully, yes, plenty of time for questions and discussion. So you may be asking yourself, I have a pretty good sized library. It's organized on the shelf pretty well. Why should I even bother cataloging? Well, if you've got shelf arrangement, like I think I've been in orchestra libraries that have music on the shelf, organized last name composer. But every time you get a new work, you may have to shift your shelves a bit. And if your collection grows and grows and grows, the shelf shifting becomes more and more onerous. You may want to switch to a cataloging system, because that allows you to organize music by accession number. So you just have to add the new piece at the end, give it the highest number, and off you go. So you have a shelf arrangement or an alphabetical system versus just a numerical system, which may aid, in fact, does aid larger collections tremendously. And as I pointed out, size of collection definitely does matter when you're considering cataloging. You also have to consider the time investment. If you don't have a catalog already, do you have the time to start one? Also, a good reason to have a catalog is if you're sharing information, especially in a distributed environment, such as Russ finds himself now, I think with the Williamsburg Symphony, you're working with them. Well, especially also during COVID times, you've got people in different states or different cities. Not everybody has access to the music or the collection. It's in a storage unit. And so the catalog is the only way that multiple people in multiple locations can access the information about the music. So a catalog is vital for this symphony in that situation. There are likely other good reasons to have a catalog. Russ, can you think of anything else that we haven't covered?
Inventory control for one thing. If you should need to, God forbid, have an accident, fire, flood, as some of our MOLA members have had happen to them. If you need to document what material you owned and how much it would cost to replace such a thing in event of an emergency, a catalog could be very helpful for that.
Absolutely, indeed. I'm going to interrupt this screen share just a minute to make sure we have everybody in from the waiting room and just to check the chat. All right, thank you very much. We are good to go. Russ, can you talk to us about some options for cataloging, for capturing this data? If you do decide to go ahead and catalog your collection, what are some of the options we have available for that?
Well, the two biggest that probably most of us have used in the past is OPAS and ArtsVision. And as a disclaimer, I haven't used OPAS for many years, although I did use ArtsVision at Juilliard. And the benefit for this kind of software package is that it is an all-in-one set of software packages, in that your library can use it to record their library information. Your personnel managers can use it to see what instrumentation is needed for the programs coming up and hire personnel accordingly. Your stage managers can use it as well to help set stages and make sure there are enough chairs and stands for the orchestra or the ensemble. So that's the advantage to something that big. The drawback is it is very big, and you really need to take full advantage of it in order to justify sometimes the expense for something like that. The next step back would be creating a database for yourself. That involves just a little bit of, not so much programming, but a good awareness of the database software so that you can create a system that will work for you, that will benefit your library. Or, as Jane mentioned, if you need to share that information with anyone else in your organization, conductors or personnel managers or program note writers, you might be able to set up an internal software application that will work on an intranet. Or I think all of these also have availability to set up so they can be shared through the internet as well. I know certainly FileMaker Pro can do that. FileMaker Pro is one of the bigger ones. If you have the Microsoft suite of applications with Microsoft Word and Excel, Microsoft Access is often available there also. The next step back would be, in my opinion, spreadsheets. I like databases because you have a lot more flexibility with how you enter data perhaps, but also how you can search it and store it and do specialized reports. Spreadsheets don't give you quite as much flexibility in that way, but you can record a lot of information. And most of us have used either Microsoft Excel or the Apple Numbers system. And there's also, through the Google online system, Google Sheets. So that would be one easy way to share that kind of information. Another step back would be just going with a word processing document. And Microsoft Word and Pages and even Google Docs have the facility to use tables. And that can be a nice way to structure information in a table system, most of which also will let you export that table information into a document that you can read with your spreadsheet or even your database. So it can be flexible in that way. And I came in the library profession, as many of us did, with 3x5 cards. I've used those for years. When I got to the Marine Band, we still had 3x5 cards. And during my time there, we started our first database. And that was very interesting to see the steps we had to take to transfer those printed bits of information into bytes in a computer database.
I will say, file cards give you the least trouble. They don't crash. They don't disappear on you. They're the most stable format, really, for cataloging. But many may find that just too old school. Thanks for covering that, Russ. Whoops. Sorry, I'm checking. I think I have. folks in the waiting room. I think we're good. Right, they're joining us. All right. So now that we've talked about cataloging, where you could capture this information. Oh, and Russ, I meant to ask you, Sarah in Kalamazoo had asked about free database software or free cataloging software. Do you remember that question? We had that in email.
Yes, I'm sure there are some resources available on the internet that I'm not aware of. I know through Google, they have a platform where you can contact other database providers. Google doesn't, to my knowledge, provide one themselves, but you can reach out through this portal and contact database providers that you can work with independently through their system.
Okay, it's a question I got asked a lot when I was at the Marine Band. People cataloging choral music or band music or orchestra music or whatnot. Is there any free software for this? And I never have found any free software for doing this type of work. There's almost always some cost associated. It's really when you get down into the spreadsheet level, I feel like that the cost really starts to go down because FileMaker is a purchase. Yeah, 3x5 cards are the cheapest.
Yep.
It's a little harder to share the information though in a distributed environment. So we'll move on and say, like when you're cataloging, what information do you want to capture? And it's very basic. You need a location number. It's either an accession number or box folder number or shelf number. Where can you find it? Where is it living? And after that, the biggest pieces of information you would need to capture: title, composer, editor and arranger, and publisher. It's very basic. You can get away with just that. You can probably find find what you need or find all the things relevant to what you need with this system right here. But many music performance libraries capture more information than that if they're cataloging multiple composers. And you'll want to capture these in separate fields for a lot of good reasons. Alternate titles, because how many different ways can you spell a title? So many, so many. Musical form, and this really helped us at the Marine Band because we were always very keen to figure out our solos. And solo for us was a form as opposed to a symphony or a gavotte or a march. And it was very nice to be able to search on all of the marches by John Philip Sousa. Instrumentation is also another key field that helps a lot of music performance libraries because sometimes we're trying to search on a particular instrumentation. What do we have for just brass ensemble, as some of us may be doing right now, or what do we have for just strings? So being able to search on instrumentation and capture that field is helpful for searching and programming, but also if you have the information available and can provide that quickly to your administrators, that's a wonderful thing to be able to do. I know in the Marine Band Library, topics and keywords and subjects were something we cataloged with that helped us find the strangest music, but like we were doing a kids show and we looked for music about bugs, any music that had anything to do with bugs. And it really depended on how well we'd cataloged the piece. If we'd realized the piece had something with a bug in it or in the title or was about insects. Sometimes you can get into programming these shows or assisting folks who are programming shows and you need topical stuff. Also patriotic music was a big topic we used, and holiday music was a huge subject we used. These are the ones that I remember coming in specifically helpful for us and for our conductors and those who were programming.
And I remember, Jane, if I can pop in.
Please, yeah.
Not long after I got to the Marine Band, we got a call from the 4-H Clubs of America, who was having their convention in Washington, D.C. and wanted the band to come and play and asked for the band to play the 4-H Club March, which they didn't know what the title was or the composer. And we were still at the 3x5 cards at that point. And it took a couple of days of research and someone looking in the book to find out that the title was Pride of the Land, which never would have popped up in any search. So when we made our first database, this keyword field was vital and saved us a lot of work. Also at the Boston Pops, we did a show for the American Heart Association, who was coming to town that night. So we didn't have this kind of information in a database that we could search for heart or anatomy. And it came down to Trivial Pursuit session in the library trying to think of titles that had heart or some association. So keyword, I think, can be a very helpful field to have in your database.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And just to compare and contrast, when I had a conductor contact me who was programming a Halloween style concert, I was able to do a search that probably would take you, 2 days in the cards, it took me 15 minutes to pull up all the tunes that were spooky or Halloween related. So it really saved us quite a bit of time. And yes, we got questions like that a lot. I'm going to stop running down this slide really quickly and ask a couple of questions that have come through the chat. Is there a good resource on how to set up a card catalog? Russ, is your book a good resource for that?
Yeah, that's something I talk about a bit, I think, in both of the books, but the one that's got the most information along those lines is the Manual for the Performance Library. Not to hawk my materials, but there's a large section on cataloging in there, and where it doesn't necessarily follow along the lines of what real catalogers or real librarians would do, I geared it more towards people who have to have that job thrust upon them. So here's basic information that you can record, and it'll talk a little more in detail about the same things we're speaking of here.
Thank you, Russ. And Chris, if we didn't fully answer your question, please feel free to contact us via email later for more clarification and assistance.
Yeah.
We also have a question. Oh, yes. Oh, so the software program that I'm showing on the screen here, this is a screen capture from OPAS. Is that correct, Russ?
Yes.
Thank you. So I hope that helps answer that question. Some more key fields I feel like are really helpful when cataloging and then researching in a database or a spreadsheet. Notes, just a text field for just capturing information about the piece, random bits that are really not structured information. That notes field has saved my tail more than once, especially if the first words are "do not use," because sometimes there's an edition of a work that we have in the library that we're going to keep, but it's not anything that our current conductors wanted to see. Cuts, keys, start, stops, anything pertinent about that piece that gets recorded over time as you play through it can be very helpful and can really save you. Performance history is something else I also really enjoyed being able to capture in a database system, because we often got asked, when was the last time it was played? When was the first time this organization played it? Because that's important for program notes and such bits. Performance history is also fabulous for seeing if a piece has been conducted more slowly or more quickly over time. Who has conducted it? How long has your organization been performing that work? It's really a rich place. And it also helps programmers know not to maybe program that work again so quickly. Space those performances out. Really, anything you get asked frequently could be a field in your database or on your catalog cards. Anything that would save you time later in trying to answer. If you find yourself having to go to the stacks often, or in Russ's case, which would be almost impossible if you're not actually sitting in the Williamsburg Symphony Library, but anything you can have in a data format that can help you answer questions quickly and efficiently and save you time, that would be wonderful to have.
I had a professor in college who loved her first online library catalog, because then her phrase would save her a walk in the rain from her house over to the library to see just if they had that book or what was available in that book. And this, in a good situation where you can share this information, might save your music director a walk or a drive down to the library to look at the physical catalog if they can share that information virtually.
Absolutely. All right, Russ.
Well,
hang on, sorry, just a second. Somebody has offered too that they take cataloging to the next step when it comes to titles. They don't record just the full title of a work, but if it's a medley or if it has multiple movements, perhaps they do individual songs. And that helps for discovery. If you're looking for a particular song, it happens to be a medley, you can excerpt and extract that and have that song available. And if you don't catalog song titles that are in medleys, for instance, you may not ever find that song.
That is an excellent point. You did that. I know we started that, the Marine Band. Did you guys continue when you went to the new catalog?
Absolutely, because I will say one thing about the Marine Band catalog is that the recording engineers also had access to that catalog, and they cataloged the recordings in the same system, and they catalog by track. And so we had to have movement names and song titles for them to tie the track into that information. So we both had to catalog at the same level in order for the data to all match up. So we did have to take the cataloging to the next step. And what I always thought of was analytics, right? If you're cataloging a book, if you actually also include all of the chapter titles, then those are the analytics. And so I always thought of song titles and medleys as cataloging the analytics of the work. But when we're talking about cataloging titles and composers, there is so much room for variation. Russ, what would we do about that?
Well, as you use the phrase structured information, and that is essentially what authority control is. You want to be consistent in how you enter the information into your database so that it always comes back when you search for it. Little things like misspellings, or the way that different publishers publish different titles on their music can really throw off a search in your database. So authority control is something that it's an extra step in your library procedure, but it will yield a lot of benefits down the road when it comes time to identifying exactly what you own. Now, one way is to use a book or a database or some other resource that you trust that has information that you can rely on when you enter that, copy it into your database. So the one item that probably all of us have on our shelves is Dave Daniels' orchestral music book, or access to the Daniels Orchestral Music Online system. And he has been very consistent in how he enters his titles and composer names, so that once you find out what you're looking for, you enter that in, and everything comes up under that title. As you look through his book, you can see everything's under the same composer name, and the titles flow in order: concerti, symphonies, things like that. You want your database to operate the same way, so that as you search something, all the incarnations of the Beethoven symphonies come together in your search. Other options, if you have access to the Grove Dictionary of Music, either in print or Oxford Music Online, Grove Music Online, you can use that. They have also got authority control there. The Library of Congress, of course, has to have authority control so that all their information comes up the same, and you can access their authority records online for titles and some other resources through the loc.gov website. And at the very least, if you have a book that you trust. For years, I'd use Nicholas Slimsky's Baker's Biographical Dictionary of Musicians, because those titles and composer names that he entered in his book were all very reliable. Plus, since he was a Russian by birth, he could transliterate all those strange Russian composer names so that I was consistent in how I entered Prokofiev and Shostakovich and all those other fellows.
Awesome. I will say, if anybody's having trouble navigating the Library of Congress authority files, you're welcome to contact me. It's not the easiest place to be. And even when I was at the Green Band, I was using the Library of Congress name authority files to find obscure composers and their birth and death dates. It sometimes was the only place I could find information about the less popular, less well-known composers. But it's not just, yeah?
I'm sorry, for specifics, I think you shared this with me too. At the Marine Band, we had a thing called the Blue Book that we used to use, which was just a printed out typewritten document that we had in a word processing file. And primarily for the reason that Jane mentioned, because in the band world, you get some unusual people who might not show up in the Grove Dictionary or in the Bakers. Lesser known composers, not new, but old. And if you've gone to the effort to find their name and document how it's spelled, you want to have that available somewhere. So also you can enter that, each work by them, in there in a consistent manner.
They're still using that. It's an internal authority source for sure. And I can't believe you still have a printed blue copy of that. That's amazing. The man who never throws anything away.
That's me.
Is this
Well,
this is a further example of what you're talking about with authority control, right?
this is as ripped from the headlines, as you would say on Law and Order. These are 4 different incarnations of the New World Symphony that were in my library here at the Naval School of Music. Now, band arrangements, granted, but here's the problem that you can run into. If you just typed in the title as it appears in each of these different arrangements, you may or may not ever get all 4 of those to come back unless you use the right search terms. So one thing to keep in mind as you use these authority sources, you want to use them as you enter information, but you also want to be aware of using them as you search for the information, and make other people who have access to your catalog aware of that as well. So looking at these titles here, these 4 different pieces, New World are the only words that really appear consistently. Maybe symphony, but even then, if you look at the names of the composers, each publication spells Dvorak's name differently, and none of them have the full title as it appears there at the bottom of the slide. That's got all the information accurate. And even one of you'll notice number 3 has the old publication number for the New World Symphony back before the publisher reconciled all the symphonies in chronological order. So this is a living example of what you might run into in your library and why you need some kind of authority control.
So you have standardized your cataloging for each of these. You've standardized on the correct full title.
Yes.
Good.
And one thing.
And also, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. One thing that someone asked earlier was in OPAS. There's actually 3 different fields. And when you spoke about the information to capture, Jane, you mentioned having a secondary field for title. In OPAS, I believe they call a master title, which is very much like this correct full title, or what you'd find in an LC authority file. They also have a print title that they use for their publications. If you're going to export this information out to a word processor document and use that as part of your program handout, the print title might differ from the master title, just the way you arrange things, because in databases, you have to be aware of sometimes where you put commas and spaces so that the information all sorts out in order. And I think the 3rd OPAS title was something to be used for maybe alternate titles or different spellings or translations of the same title. At one point we had at the Marine Band, and I'm not sure if you guys still had it, we had the title, a field for the title as it appeared on the actual music, much like you'd see with these New World examples. So that if a piece of music got lost, and they had a lost child that was separated from the rest of the set, you could type in the title as it appeared on the music, and it would come up and tell you what it was you were looking for.
There's a whole handbook for cataloging at the Marine Band. It's a list of rules and guidelines and policies. That we have 6 people cataloging the same system, so you need to make sure you're all doing it the same. And that rule in particular was Kathy's rule.
Yes.
Yes. Type it exactly as you see it on the piece of music. And something that made all that work, having all those different titles, up to 4 or 5 different titles for a piece of music, was when you did a search, it searched all those title fields. I was very lucky to have that ability. Something else, Russ, that this example points out why it's important to be able to capture arrangers, editors, transcribers, because these are all different. I think I see Lython twice, but really you have 3 different arrangements here. That's you have different editions, so that's very important information to capture. Okay, we have some really good information that's come in. Arts Vision has these kinds of different titles: the library title, artistic title, marketing, and uniform title field. But for this user, it's not clear which name exports to which field. But that use in Archivist reflects how many different people are coming for titles and how they need them differently. Now, it's not just names and titles, but we also have the subject we're talking about: patriotic, holiday, bug.
Exactly, because you could spell things differently. small things. Now for genres there, you have to make some decisions if you're going to add this information into your database. And again, primarily to be consistent. Are you going to call something a tone poem or a symphonic poem? If you have a march, are you going to say, if you have a French spelling of a march, are you going to enter everything by English? If your database users are English, you should probably stick with English forms and genres that you're going to be using. So here are a couple resources that will help you standardize some of these forms. The Library of Congress genre form terms is something that they just started a number of years ago, a few years ago, that has a lot of resources for how you can identify specific genres, not just march or symphony, but things beyond that. And you can get as detailed as you want to. And even the Music Library Association has their best practices document, which is very helpful to kind of get a handle on all of those genre form terms and narrow your focus on how much you want to use. And there's even a brief list in the back of the Green Book, the manual for the Performance Library, that has that kind of thing. But the same thing with your subject and topical terms. You want to be consistent in how you enter this information so that you can find it again when you search for it. And as Jane mentioned, you've got 6 people working in your library, all of them doing cataloging. When we first put the Marine Band library on a database, we had everybody, 6 people, all entering with different sections from the library, different pieces. And we wound up with at least 2 meetings a week to sit down and talk about things we discovered and make these decisions for how we were going to enter different titles, terms, names, and structure that information so it was consistent from person to person for years to come when it came down to finding this information. So if you're going to add subject terms or topical terms, you can also use the Library of Congress subject headings. Sometimes those are a little odd, so you have to be able to make decisions on a local basis, things that you're going to use. And if you do anything out of the ordinary, you might want to also start your own blue book so that you have a list of how you have done things. And again, there's a brief list in the back of the Green Book. And there's also an article that was published in Marcado a number of years ago that listed other resources for subject terms and topical terms. That's something that if you search for a given symphony, say the Beethoven Pastoral in the Library of Congress, it's not going to mention any subject information about that symphony. So they typically don't bother with that step when it comes to musical pieces of music, that is. So if you want that kind of information about that works in your library that's going to pertain to what subject these pieces are about, you're going to have to probably do some of that on your own. And that's where these other resources could come in handy.
Yes, it's something that I think I find as a recurring theme as we're talking about our cataloging rules, our local authority control if we've developed lists like the Blue Book. What we're talking about is documentation. If you're standing up cataloging in your library, do create documentation about what you're doing and why you capture your practices. That will ensure a continuity of operations if you're to leave and someone else comes in, or if you have a leave of absence and somebody needs to be cataloging in your system. Having that documentation available will really help somebody not think they have to recreate the wheel, but they can just keep cataloging as you were cataloging, and the system will make more sense to them if you do have good documentation about it. That's just a side note, because the last thing I think we really wanted to touch on here was instrumentation.
And as to follow up actually with what you mentioned, Jane, the more people you have cataloging in your library, the more you're going to have to coordinate activities. Now, if it's just you doing it, that's fine. But if you retire or move on, I'd be wary of doing something so complicated that your people who follow you have to figure it out. I remember talking to some band librarians in the Marine Fleet bands. And one fellow came in, took over the librarian job, and couldn't for the life of him figure out the complex system of decimals and letters that the predecessor had used to locate things on the shelf. And he only had a couple of years in the library, but he spent it undoing that system and using something a little more standardized, just so there wasn't such a high learning curve with finding where you put things and how you enter information. So all of us may or may not need to know instrumentation in our databases. Of course, Dave Daniels' book has got this information there, and the examples for the, at least for the brass instruments, for Fanfare for the Common Man and the Symphonie Fantastique, he can break that down so it's very detailed, and you know not just what instruments are required, but doublings, which will be helpful for your personnel managers. And he even gets more detailed. I think I didn't include all the percussion details, but Dave has got that in his book as well. And the advantage to putting instrumentation in your database is that with certain parameters, you'll know as you pull a piece up what's required, but you might also be able to search for it. And that example with a Fanfare for the Common Man, depending how you structure that information, you can enter that in your database and come up with other pieces that would fit that instrumentation for that same concert. As Jane mentioned, as the times here and with reduced pandemic performances, you might need to know what all you have for specific instrumentation in your library. When it comes to band music and chamber music, the book that was published a couple of years ago focuses on band repertoire. It was also published as part of that Roman and Littlefield Music Finder series. So this person took Dave Daniels' code and added a number on either side of the winds and brass to cover saxophones and euphoniums. So that's one way you can also adapt the same system and get a little bit more in detail. And the example at the bottom is another excerpt from the Symphonie Fantastique, arranged for band, that has full instrumentation listed there, so you know exactly how many players you need. My only recommendation there, especially if you're dealing with band music, orchestra music winds tend to be one per part. And in band music, you're going to run into people and arrangements that have divisis, so that for 3 clarinet parts, first, second, and third, if there are divisi passages in there, you're going to need to document that so that you know that, okay, there are 6 players needed to fill out that chord, and 3 on those 3 parts, and make sure that you hire or assign enough players to cover the instrumentation for the piece that it was as it was written.
Codes are not mandatory. You don't have to use an instrumentation code. You can just write it out. In fact, there are major ensembles just literally writing out. So it's very clear for everybody in the organization. This piece requires first, flute, seconds, 4 clarinet, 4 saxophones, SATB. Just using very more plain language and not using instrumentation code, and do what works for your organization, what you think people are going to understand, what is going to lead to the least confusion. If your organization works with and is familiar with the Daniels code, by all means, that's a pretty efficient way to go about it. Trying to do this in a band library sometimes might lead to utter confusion. Even though to a librarian, it looks pretty straightforward. Maybe nobody else in the organization is going to know how to decode that. It depends on what is the general understanding and yeah, in your organization. But these are code options of spelling things out are not a good idea for you all.
Yep, sometimes natural language is all that is needed and something everyone can understand. We talked about performance history as something you can also record. This was a screenshot from might have been OLIS years ago, but it shows this type of information you might want to document for your library. Certainly when the piece was played, what dates, what conductors. At one point I was recording string principals on my performance records for the Williamsburg Symphony, so they knew who had done the bowings at that time that was associated with that. And you can have, if you have multiple sets, multiple editions of a piece, you might want to record that as well, so that you know that Andrew Davis used the Breitkopf edition, or James Levine used the Haydn Mozart Press edition. And you understand that this piece was used, this set was used with this conductor. For my performance history, I sometimes will record a other things I've done to it. I can make a note that I did errata on this piece from the MOLA errata list on this date, so that I know that work has been done to the set of parts. But also if there's later errata information that comes about, you can realize, oh, I didn't get that errata corrected. I need to go back and add that information to know just what work I have done to this set of parts, and I don't duplicate any effort.
I believe this example, Russ, performance history, is that from OPAS as well?
I think so. It's probably a little bit newer, but that does look like the
2013.
same kind of information. Yeah.
Yeah, 2013. Well, we've talked a little longer than I meant, but I hope it was all good information. We have time now for questions, discussion. I've been keeping up with the chat and interjecting questions, but you're welcome to unmute yourselves now and we can discuss, go over anything that we might have gotten wrong or if you have questions about. We will sit here patiently in the awkward silence.
Well, I put a question in the chat. Hi, everybody. Manny Romero, Manhattan School of Music. And it's really about Access, which the New York Pops catalog that I inherited is in Access. And that was sort of a learning curve for me, learning how to use Access. I'm by no means a pro with it. But what I'm wondering if other people have experience using tables such as Access or Excel, say, where you want to have some sort of three-dimensionality where, you know, especially for performance history, I'd like to be able to, you know, it's all just X, Y, and I'd like to be able to go deeper into one of those, you know, boxes to be able to list performance history and more information about each one of those and so forth. I haven't really figured out a way to do that except for really long lines of text, which then when I switch to a card view is a little easier to read. But I'm just curious if anybody has any bright ideas about that.
I know when I was at NEC, I started making separate databases for some of that information. And I think if you use what they call a relational database, you can connect fields of information from one database to another. And mine was very rudimental. I mean, I think the more time you spend with the manual might answer some of those questions, but I know there are ways that you can link information without having one enormous database.
You can certainly link tables. I've never tried to link databases, but you can certainly link tables in a relational setup like Access. But I used to know how to do that and I have long forgotten. I am sorry, Manly.
Well, maybe just knowing that you once did will give me the morale boost to pursue that. Thank you both.
It is, if I could do it, it is possible. But it's like any language. When I stopped speaking it, I've forgotten so much. Has anybody else had any success with what Manly's asking about?
I think the key is a relational database, but I don't know anything about Access. I just have such a strong dislike for it. But I think the key is relational files. And as Jane mentioned, you can have tables relate to each other. If you have separate databases, the key would be to then recreate those as tables in the one you're using. You can do that by an export and an import.
Robert?
Yeah, Bob, you had quite a sophisticated database at the Met, I know. Was that all one file or were there related tables?
Well, there were 20 some odd related tables before the days when FileMaker had tables. They were separate files that were linked. And it just sort of grew like an octopus. But the key is to have a relational system built up. And you know, you were mentioning about authority control. Something to consider for anybody here who deals with a lot of vocal scores is inevitably you're going to have to put them on a shelf, except that the spelling of how they're published versus what their official title is versus what other controls might call them can get to be very complicated. So what I did at the Met, we just simply had a separate field. How have we filed this, or where have we put it on the shelf? And then I had at least 2 or 3 other title fields. One would be as the publisher published it. One would be what it should have been with proper spelling. One would be what it might be called in English for those who couldn't. This is especially a problem with Cyrillic, for example,
Yes.
where you've got the Russian title, but then you have like a transliteration of the Cyrillic, but there's so many different variations on that. We used to go nuts when we would get a transliterated aria title, for example, say for the National Council program. And we'd go crazy trying to figure out, well, what is it? Because I could never find 2 people who spelt it the same way. So I'm a big fan of all sorts of title fields. And then certainly in FileMaker, it's possible to set up a global search that'll search all of those and return all of the variations when you do the search for any one of them. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that was just my best bet at trying to figure out how to make sense of it all.
Thank you. That does help.
I've got a question. Are there any good resources for cataloging digital files? As we get more and more digital bowing masters and even videos of, you know, performances or whatever, is it best to just dump as much information as you can into a title, or do you try to tag things with metadata? Are there certain conventions that people are following that are useful?
If you haven't heard too much of me already, at the Met, I had a link to where the digital files were in the database. So I could use the database to look up whatever I wanted and then just click on the link and it would take me right to the file and open it up.
How did you, and that's a quick, Jane, you might have more experience with this since a lot of your work is digital. How would you name digital files so you don't wind up with a 40 character file name?
Something I did consistently with digital files is I would combine parts into a single PDF. I couldn't deal with so many little multiple PDFs. It drove me bonkers. So I would make them into one PDF. I'd have a score PDF and I'd have a parts PDF. I believe I just used the title of the work and the works went into a folder by composer. So we had a file structure. We could have done what Bob Sutherland did. We could have linked in our database. However, we could not trust that the IT department would not change our server names or somehow globally break all the links overnight at once. So we did not invest the time in setting up linking in our database. We just had a hunt and seek sort of attitude toward our digital files. At the time I left, we were still printing everything. Our go-to was the paper version of music. We did keep the files, we named them, we could reference them, we could go back to them. We just had to know the composer name to get to the right folder. And then we had to know the title of the work to get to the right PDFs. That is a simplified version of what we were doing at doing that when I left. I am currently not working with any digital files at Library of Congress, but that may be coming in the future for me. So I'll be curious to see how it works there when we're accepting digital music files. I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope it helps. I do want to get to some questions that have come in the chat. In regards to performance histories, does anyone find value in keeping track of canceled performances? And if you do that, are there any ideas out there about what information to include in relation to a canceled performance? Larry, go for it. What you got?
performance history, including canceled performances, is problematic in a database, but in a word processing document or whatever, it's simple. The reason it's problematic in a database, very few of us in this call are going to forget in 5 years what the year 2020 was like. In the year 2050, MOLA might not have such great corporate memory about 2020. I don't think I'll be in the library in 2050, but one never knows. So if you delete the performances from your database, they're gone. But if you leave them in the database in 2050, and someone says, when's the last time we played some obscure work? And oh, look, it was in April of 2020. How come I can't find any information for it? Where are the parts? What did we use? Where's the rental order? So you have to track what you prepared and what you were thinking of playing, but putting it in the database, if you're going to look up previous performances, is problematic. At least at the New York Philharmonic, the database in which we track everything, our proprietary version is called Carlos, drives the online performance history accessible to the entire world. So you don't want the entire world in the year 2030 or in the year 2021 to look and see what the New York Philharmonic played in April of 2020, because we didn't play anything. So the stuff has to come out of the database. And I'm afraid I've had to go to every works entry that we were going to play and put in notes, scheduled for performance, March 2, 3, 4, 2020, canceled, or something like that. So it's important to track, but be careful of where you track it.
I would say on a canceled performance, record all the same information that we've talked about, that we showed in the examples, but also maybe why it was canceled, if it's politically correct to say why it was canceled. It has always helped me to know when a piece went out on the stands, it got marked, it had a particular conductor. So it didn't get put on the performance, but you have an understanding of what happened to that work over time and why it looks like it does, even though it didn't get performed. Oh, okay, it was out on the stands, it was being rehearsed, but oh, that's why it looks like that.
Like Jane said, I always kept track of canceled performances and I left them in the database, but I had set up searches so you could omit them, or you could just see what was canceled, because I'm thinking with the opera, there's some we put months of preparation in. There were specific cut sheets for specific singers with specific keys. And I always wanted that information to be there.
Absolutely.
But also wanted to realize it didn't take place, so that we at least know where we're starting from next time.
Absolutely. I'm going to go into the chat. We've got someone who's currently learning about Airtable, and I've seen an example of Airtable. It's a neat, really useful, powerful online tool. This person's marketing department is really enthusiastic about it, and they use it for all sorts of record keeping. There are useful ways that you can link various tables and records to one another, and you can upload pictures, PDFs to each record as well. Mostly it's being used right now planning for rights tracking. It is a paid software tool online. Some people might find it worthwhile, so you're encouraged to Google it from this user. I will say, I believe if you're going to be cataloging in Airtable, I believe all your information is in the cloud. I know that's the way the world's going, but I'm a little old school. If I don't have control of my data set, I'm going to feel a little weird about that. Your data set's going to be in the cloud. You'll have to pay for access constantly. And I'm not sure what it'd be like to migrate data in and out of Airtable. So some things to keep in mind.
And backups along that line. I'm still old school enough. I like to have paper, but if you're going to do a database, back up your work, or if you can back up what you've put on the cloud. There will be times when the power goes out and you still get a question about, hey, don't we have this or that?
Exactly. We've had a suggestion for a digital naming format, composer last name, short title, instrument, year of bowings. And this is someone's naming convention. So an example would be Beethoven Sim 9, Violin 1, 2018. What different tipping points have been reached to move from an alphabetical to accession-based catalog? So what has tipped the balance in favor of, all right, I finally gotta just do it. I gotta sit down and start typing all this in. I think size and inability to shift material is a big one. Russ, any other ideas? Well, we talked about accessibility in a distributed environment.
Size definitely has driven all the decisions I've seen at the libraries I've worked in. When I got to NEC, it was clear that Betty and Rob before me had started with the alphabet, because I could look at the left side, box number 1 was Bach, and it went followed right through. But I think Rob realized at some point, I'm receiving so much stuff, I can't be shifting all the time, and he changed it to a numerical system. So size drives things, and also how large is the collection going to grow? If it's something that's going to continue to amass materials, it's easier just to leave everything fixed on the shelf and give it a number. The only issue then is you have to be a good manager of that information and record that number or that information someplace. When I took over the NEC Wind Ensemble Library, it had been run by student conductors for years, not all of whom were necessarily fluent with numbers and 3x5 cards. And I discovered I had 5 different sets of the whole first suite in that collection because someone forgot to write down the number. When it came time to do it again, we can't find the old set, we got to have it, let's buy a new one. So good record keeping is important, but we're all librarians, and that shouldn't be an issue for us, right?
Tipping point. The very first time you put something in a place where it doesn't belong and say, oh, I'll remember that it's over on the left down the hall in a closet. I think that should be a signal. Your successor won't remember where you put it.
Mm-hmm.
No, good point.
Yeah.
In large collections, if it isn't cataloged, it doesn't exist. This is the concept of bibliographic control. If you can't find it, you don't have it, you have to go buy it again. So it's a ineffective use of resources if you're not cataloging, if you're not gaining intellectual or bibliographic control of your collection. If you don't have any sort of other way to find it, such as shelf arrangement, you may not have it. Or if you have shelf arrangement and, as Larry said, misfiled it, you don't know you don't have it. So we've had a suggestion from the chat regarding digital cataloging, their organization switching over to Office 365. So if you have access to Office 365, this product allows you to add extra columns of metadata to your files instead of having to include it all in the title. This has potential. So if you have, again, access to Office 365, you may find some good options there. So here's an OPAS tip for canceled performances. Our organization has retained the performance in OPAS, but no repertoire is attached to it. And then a repertoire list with soloist names in the note field of the performance record with a prominent note that it was canceled. So there's an option in that system for keeping track of these canceled performances, but not necessarily tagging the works to those performances. Here's an instrumentation question. Our youth orchestra also has a chamber music library, and I was wondering if anyone combines their chamber and orchestral music into the same catalog, and is the Daniels Code a good way to handle that?
I don't see why not.
Mm-hmm.
I've had several different catalogs merged together, and in fact, the one I'm using now was intended primarily for books, for real book libraries, and making it fit a performance library has taken some negotiation. I stuck with a code when I started to enter my small ensemble and chamber music collection, and it was the example on the slide for, I think it was the Fanfare for the Common Man. I didn't put in any doublings. I reduced everything down to numbers only, separated with a couple dashes. And that way I could search by number of players, if not by exact instrumentation. So if I typed in 11110-1, I could get all my woodwind quintets to pop up. And it took me a while to figure that out because of the limitations of the database I was working with. But once I got that and could rely on doing those sorts consistently, I put everything in that same format. But that catalog now has marching band, concert band, chamber music, woodwind and brass ensembles, and even solo music in it.
There are a couple of different ways to differentiate between, if you're combining catalogs, if you want to catalog chamber with orchestra, your location codes could look different, which could help signal band versus or orchestra versus chamber, or you could just add a column for type and put in orchestra or chamber. That way you could bring up all your chamber works if you want, or all your orchestra works. You could see them separately if you prefer. But I don't see any reason not to combine them and be able to use the same instrumentation codes. Here's an, let's see, an Arts Vision tip for Arts Vision users. It has a confirmed but canceled dropdown in the project. It puts a strike through in the project works in the calendar, which is helpful, but the work still populated performance histories as having been played. Oh, not a tip, but it's something Arts Vision has been asked to look at. Here's a tipping point for somebody: becoming difficult to find anything in all the misfiled works. Yeah, that could be a problem. Ballet librarians, if you're still there, how do you catalog 3 or more part ballets by ballet name or composer or by choreographer? Matt Naughton, are you still here? Or any ballet librarian? How are you cataloging 3 or more part ballets? Well, if you're not going to speak up, I hope you put your answer in the chat and maybe I'll read it here in a minute. And yes, we've gone over an hour, but I'm willing to continue the discussion as long as you're sticking around and have questions. Russ, is that okay with you?
It's fine with me.
Somebody says that their chamber and orchestral music is cataloged together and that the Daniel code works well for wind music, but less well for strings. So they modify it a bit. Do what works best for your organization. All right. Oh, actually, I did get to the end of the chat messages. Anybody else want to speak up? I'm happy to not read and let you just speak for yourselves.
Hello, Chris here.
Hi, Chris.
I was wondering if there was any tips or tricks. I'm looking at needing to do a complete overhaul of our complete cataloging system. I inherited a spreadsheet that had composer last name, title, and shelf number, and that's all I got. And it's not really serving our needs. So I'm kind of looking at having to do a cataloging of the entire entire collection. So is there any tips on how to do that while still doing all of my other library responsibilities?
Well, I'm sure Russ and I both have some tips for that. I will say congrats. They got you started off on the right foot. You've got just basic information. You weren't overwhelmed with a lot of bad information. So I feel like you're starting in a really good place. Decision to make: are you going to stay in the same system and just make the data better? Or are you going to translate this into a different system? So that's a decision. One thing I would offer, just add a column, a checkbox, something that says, I have reviewed this record. This record has been reviewed by me. The data is better. I don't have to look at it again. I can now trust the data that's here. That'll help you separate the bad from the good. Now, Russ has been going through his entire library, which is pretty big, and his entire database bit by bit. Can you offer some tips on how you've been systematically and slowly upgrading your data, Russ?
Your idea about a field for a check field for done, I've seen it, is something I also use. In fact, I record the date that I do it, so I know that if I've made a change to my process, I can have to go back and see the pieces that didn't get done under that previous process. But it's tedious, and I'm finding lots of embarrassing things that my predecessors did, but it's good to actually physically touch the item and see what you've got. And that way you can go through and determine, hey, we're missing all the violas for this set, or what parts are missing. You have to, I think, to start, determine what you want to know. You've got composer, you've got title, you've got shelf location or box number. What else do you want to know that you think you need to have at your fingertips to save yourself a walk in the rain, to go to the back, to pull the physical item? And then I used to, when I was making a new database, and I used to just sit down with a piece of paper and write it down. What do I need to see? How do I want to structure that information? So that when I got into create the fields or restructure the data, I knew where I was going. And you'll always find some things that you have to revisit and restructure, but having a plan attack before you begin will save you some steps along the way, I think.
Creating documentation as you go. And we touched on this earlier, we didn't call it this, but making sure whatever path you pick is sustainable. What's enough information to have on hand, but what's not going to kill you and stop the project eventually. Sustainability. That also helps for continuity of operations going forward. I know some librarians, when they've embarked on a cataloging improvement project or an outright, we've got to get this catalog project, they set aside, okay, I'm going to do 5 titles a day. Or you learn how many things can I do in 30 minutes? How many titles can I catalog in 30 minutes? And if you can set aside maybe 30 minutes a day, you just sort of keep chipping away at that mountain with a spoon, and eventually you get there. And Russ, you may do it, you may have set aside an hour a week, optimistically, like I'm going to carve out an hour a week where I spend doing this. And I know things are going to hit the fan and they're going to be higher priorities, but surely at the end of a quiet, maybe in your case, Friday, for other colleagues, maybe the first hour on a Tuesday, it's not so bad. That's your quiet cataloging time. And you just chip away at that mountain with your little spoon, and eventually it will get done. I hope those tips help, Chris. Let me know if you have any more questions about that.
No, thank you. This is the pep talk I needed. So thank you.
Choose sustainability.
Jane and Russ.
Hi, Blaine.
Hi. First of all, thank you both for doing this. This has been great. I love the shirt, by the way.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
It's great.
And also, I really appreciated your help. We had a disaster in our library recently in August, and so similar to Chris, the spreadsheet that I inherited didn't have a ton of information in it, and I've just sort of been sticking with the same system all these years and thinking, someday when I have free time, I would love to go in and put in all of the information that I really need. And I just kept putting it off. And then one day we had a burst water pipe in the library, and I found myself wishing that I had done that sooner. So, I tried to document with pictures all of the damage, because some of the stuff had to be just thrown out straight away. Not a lot of it, but so I ended up creating a new spreadsheet that had direct links to the photograph of the damaged music, which then when I came back to try to price out replacements, it really helped to have that visual information to try to track everything down. But I'm just saying, all of your rainy day projects that you're putting off, it's much better to try this incremental, little bits at a time, because you just never know what's going to happen in your library.
Thank you, Blaine, for that tip and sharing your experience, which I'm really sorry you had to have, but you've learned some things from that, and thank you for sharing it with us. I will say another way to approach improving your metadata, your catalog data, is have that column or that checkbox data reviewed as of date. Again, that's a key for you to know, I can trust this data now. I don't have to look at it again. This work is as fully cataloged as I want it to be. But you can do that as the works are being programmed. So as you're getting the work off the shelf, you have your catalog record open. Go ahead and fill out the record right then. You have all this stuff at hand. You're not making a special trip or a special project to do anything. It's already right there all in front of you. Take the opportunity to update your data, get it as spiffy as you want, check that box, and then that's a record you don't have to look at again. You know, it's on an as needed, as ongoing basis. Something I've seen other libraries do as well.
Also gives you a little sense of accomplishment too.
Yeah, you can go back and search on all the check boxes of I love this data, and you can see I only have 5 so far. Oh, now I have 25. Now I have 1,000 records that I've looked at and said are good to go. We've got a couple of tips in the chat. Arts Vision has created a music library beta test module. Is anyone else testing this? Please contact Pat McGinn at Milwaukee Symphony. He'd love to talk to you. Ooh, somebody's very lucky. Nixon gets interns to help. You do have to train them, and you have to do quality control and check their data and maybe retrain them. But if you can get help, if you have anybody who wants to volunteer, for instance, cataloging could be a good thing. I know when I spent a summer working with the National Symphony, they threw me right in the middle of OPAS and said, go for it. And it was terrifying, but I learned a ton, and I'm glad I got a few months experience at least with OPAS. Anyone else?
I would just say, don't be afraid to step in. It's going to seem like a daunting task. I decided to, as Jane said, I've just started my library from item number 1. I'm only up to, after doing this for a year, I'm up to item 140, I think. So I don't get as much time to spend with it as I'd like. But unfortunately, I've discovered things that, you know, sidetrack me. My predecessors, I seem to have more horror stories than success stories, but my predecessors decided at one point to catalog all of the brass ensemble and woodwind ensemble pieces into the concert band collection. Okay, someone else then a few years later said, oh, no, that's a bad idea. Let's take them out. When they took them out, though, they didn't fill in those intervening numbers. So now I have gaps of 2, 3, 10 numbers that aren't being used on my shelf. And I have, I think around 15,000 concert band titles. So it's going to take me a while to get through that, but I like seeing, you know, what I've done. I've accomplished a little bit each week, and I know someday it'll get finished. And it's definitely worth the effort, though, because I know, as Jane said, I can look at a record. It's been something that I've gone through and completed, and I can trust that information when I speak to somebody else about it.
It's a good way to go about it. Everybody, if you're not watching the chat, we've had a suggestion, somebody sharing their experience that they partnered with the local library science program at the university near them, and they get a practicum student every spring, because these folks are excellent at cataloging work because they're well trained in it. So if you have a school near you that has a library science program and those kids are looking for experiences, the students are looking for experiences, they might be well placed in your library to help you out.
And documentation. I hired my first assistant last year, so now I had 2 people doing cataloging, and I had to write down all the little fussy ways that I did things so that my assistant could follow them as well. And if you have interns or people coming in, volunteers maybe, who want to help, as long as you've got even a simple set of rules for how you enter data, that'll save you a lot of time. But proofreading, I think, is a good idea. I know that when we started putting everything in the computer, the library chief went back at the end of every day and just spot checked everybody's work to see if there were issues that needed to be addressed, and we were all being consistent about how we did things.
The way that's done now is a librarian can run scripts in the database to do automatic quality control checks, and anything that pops out as unusual gets sent back to the librarian for them to fix. So you learn from your mistakes. Back to folks talking about misfiles. So you haven't tipped the balance yet. You've not decided to start cataloging. You're still going to stay with your shelf arrangement, but you're having problems because stuff isn't in the right place. If you haven't gone back and done a shelf reading, if you haven't taken a quiet week in the middle of the summer or whenever you might have a little bit of time, go back, start at A, look at everything on the shelf, pull it out, make sure it's the right thing, put it back. Go through your collection. If it's small enough for you to do that and get through it, you can correct a lot of misfiles and mistakes and still find things. You wouldn't, just because you're having misfiles doesn't mean you automatically have to start a catalog. If you shelf read every 2 to 5 years, depending on how many people in your library, if it's just you, you can stretch that time out if you trust yourself to refile things correctly. Maybe a shelf reading every 5th year. If there are a lot of people in there pulling things and putting them back in the wrong place, you may have to shelf read more often. But if you're trying to be efficient and you're not going to start a catalog, this is a way to keep things in order. It's just to go through the collection title by title or composer by composer and make sure you have everything where it needs to be. And that'll then keep you efficient through the rest of the year. You know, the time you waste trying to find something or having to repurchase it because you can't find it. You can save yourself a lot of heartache if you just do a quick shelf read occasionally.
And if you inherit a database, as I did for this Williamsburg Symphony, I just took the database and did sorts on different fields. I did a composer sort and then just looked at everything to see that I could identify the misspellings and then do a title sort. And ideally everything should come up in order, but you might find characters in the wrong place or a misspelling here and there, and that will help you clean your data in your database as well. That will also ensure that you find everything in there that you want to search for.
Dirty data can really throw you off.
That was the name of my rock band in high school, was Dirty Data, but that's so.
Awesome. All right. Well, if you need anything else, I think you're welcome to email us or post on the forum if you're a MOLA member and active in the forum. Please be in touch if you need anything or have further questions or think of something later. We'd be happy to help. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I think we will wrap this up and come to a close. And I hope we've gotten your new year started off right. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks.
Thanks, you guys.